Good morning, it's Beth from Ruth Stitchery and ruthstitchery.com, and today I wanted to do a little video kind of like an intro to paper piecing. I am doing one of my block parties this year called Autumn. This is what it looks like, and we have been doing some wool applique all year long, and their last 4 blocks that are in the center of this quilt is a crazy quilt block with wool applique on top, and the crazy quilt background is paper pieced. And so I had a few people in that class that needed a refresher. I can't remember if anyone had not done any paper piecing, but I said, you know what, let me do a video, and why not let everybody benefit from it? So I do not claim to be the expert paper piecer, so please don't feel like this video is to like replace a class by any means, but I'm just going to give you the basics, and that way you could get started. You could grab a paper piecing project, as well as my block party can get their little refresher. So this is what our quilt looks like. This is an up-close picture of just one of the paper pieced blocks, and so that is what I'm going to use to just show you the kind of the really quick nitty-gritty on paper piecing. Sometimes you'll hear it called foundation piecing. Basically, it's just a little bit of a different mindset in your sewing, in that you are going to be creating a block using some other foundation. Sometimes it's paper, sometimes it's a pre-printed interfacing. I know that there's a freezer paper version of paper piecing out there. What I'm going to show you today is sort of traditional paper piecing. You can use regular copy paper, but they do make paper piecing foundation papers, which basically, I know it's hard to see on the camera, but it's more dense than newsprint, but not quite as dense as regular copy paper. And so that's what I'm using today, but like I said, you can use regular copy paper to do this. So you get a pattern, and it's going to have whatever the block is. So a lot of designers use paper or foundation piecing because they want to make sure you get these really nice crisp points without cutting them off. I mean, who hasn't cut off a point before when you're just doing traditional piecing? And so a lot of times, if you want to make sure that all of those points are really crisp, they don't get cut off, paper piecing is a great way to do that. The New York Beauty block that looks like spikes, that is typically done with paper piecing. And so this one is a crazy quilt block. So you can see there's these odd, weird shapes on here, and I can get my block to look just like this by using this particular method. So in a paper piecing pattern, there is usually a full version of what your block is going to look like. This one in particular, in this outside line, is my unfinished block size. And so this is how a lot of patterns will be written. You'll have the lines. What's on this one that you might not see in other patterns is the actual size of fabric to cut. So you can see that she's already written in here what size fabric all these little pieces should be cut. At a minimum, you will have these pieces numbered so that you know which lines need to be stitched first. If they don't give you the size of the fabric, the easiest way to figure that out is to grab a piece of your fabric, hold it over the pattern itself, hold it up to a light, and you just want to make sure that the piece of fabric you're using at least covers that shape, a 1/4 inch. I would suggest maybe even a 1/2 inch. So you'll have a little bit of waste in paper piecing, but it's fantastic to get those really crisp points. So Some patterns will tell you what size to cut the fabrics, so others will not. This particular one did, so I have pre-cut my fabrics. I've pre-labeled them. I just took a water-soluble pen. So you can see on here, here is my A fabric, and I just drew a little A on the fabric that I'm going to use for that particular section. So I learned paper piecing from my friend Debbie, and it will forever stick in my mind, thank you Debbie, that whenever I am paper piecing, there's a little acronym that she told me, or told everybody in the class, and that is TSP, which stands for trim, sew, press. So if you ever wonder like, oh, what do I do first, or what's my next step, that's the easiest way for me to remember that. It's trim, sew, press, or TSP. So to get started, we are going to start with fabric A, and you can see on this pattern that she shows stitching line number 1. So this is the first line of stitching that I am going to do. Okay, so I'm going to take my fabric A, and this is where you have to change your mindset just a little bit. I'm stitching on the paper so I can see the lines, which means I'm actually building my block on the opposite side of that paper. So I want to take my first fabric, which is fabric A, and I want to hold it up again to the light, and I can see whether or not it is going to cover that entire shape at least a 1/4 inch around. She's very generous in this particular pattern, and so there's quite a bit of fabric that is overlaying. And so once I get that position to where I want it, I'm gonna stick a little pin. Some people will use like the water-soluble glue and just put one little line of glue on the paper to hold their fabric in place, but a little pin will work just as well. Okay, so I've got that pinned in place. And so if we go back to our acronym that I learned, the trim, sew, press, I know that the first thing I need to do is trim. And what I'm trimming is I'm giving myself my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what you will need is something a little thicker than paper. So this is just a piece of cardstock. You could use poster board. You could use regular paper if you'd folded it a couple times just so it's a little bit thicker. And then you're going to lay that piece right down on the line of the pattern. And then you're going to fold this paper over. So where I am folding this, it's folding right on that first stitch line. So you can see that this fabric is hanging out here. I'm going to take a tool that they call the add a 1/4 ruler. This comes in different sizes. This is the 12-inch one. They also make a 6-inch one. Sometimes you can buy them as a pair. Really, I usually tell people that if you're only going to get one to get started, I'd go with the 12-inch because the 12-inch can do the bigger pieces. It could also do the little ones. If you then down the road had a pattern that like a pineapple block that those lines are pretty small, you know, then maybe you'll go and get the smaller ruler, or you might want to get the set. But basically, this add a 1/4 ruler has a little lip on it, which might be difficult to see in there, but there's a little lip here. That lip is going to butt right up against that fold in the paper, okay, which is why you want to use something like cardstock or poster board, because it gives this ruler something to butt up against. So you get that, and then you trim off, basically leaving that 1/4 inch seam. So it's helpful when you do that to line the next piece of fabric up. So I'm going to flip this over, and my first stitch line is sewing fabric A to fabric B, and so I'm just going to line up the edge of my fabric B with the side that I just trimmed. So you could put a pin in here or move the original pin to pin these both down. I usually just try to grab it so that it doesn't shift. and I'm going to take this to my sewing machine. Okay. The other thing that I have learned is that it will be really helpful if you reduce your stitch length to 1.5. You could do 2. Typically, most machines will default to 2.5. I go down to 1.5. This makes sure that you get a really good perforation in the paper because, of course, the paper is not going to stay in your block. You are going to eventually rip this paper out. So I'm going to go ahead, and I usually start just 1 or 2 stitches in front of that line. And then I'm going to go ahead and stitch right on that line, and I'm going to stop just 1 or 2 stitches past that line. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to cut that off. So I did the trim, I did the sew. I can take this little pin out now. And my next step in my little acronym is to press. So I'm going to take this to my iron and I'm going to press that seam. So what you have to remember is that when you do this pressing, you are not going to be able to go back and get this seam flatter later. So because of everything that's going to get sewn to this. So you really want to try to get this seam as flat as it can be. Okay, so I did my trim, I did my sew, I did my press, and now I'm back to trim again. So I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to look at my pattern. Here is stitch line number 2. So I'm going to lay my little cardstock down right on that stitch line number 2. I'm going to fold this back, and then I'm going to take my add a quarter ruler, butt it up against where that cardstock is, and I'm going to trim so that I have a 1/4 inch seam left for my next piece, which is my piece C, and then I'm going to line that up. I'm going to either pin or hold. I'm going to go back to my machine and I'm going to stitch right on that line. Go 1 or 2 stitches past. I'm going to cut my thread. So now I'm at press. I trimmed, I sewed, now I'm going to press this. So you're going to continue doing this for all of the stitch lines that are on here. So I've done stitch line number 1, stitch line number 2. I would move on to stitch line number 3. I would go ahead, fold the fabric, I would cut my seam allowance, and then I would add piece D. And I'll just continue this around. There's 5 stitch lines on this. So this is what it ends up looking like after I have stitched all of them on here. So this is actually the back side of my paper. My pattern is on this side. So once I've got to this point, I can go ahead and trim this into the actual block size. So knowing that this block is a 6.5 inch block, I have my 6.5 inch ruler that I am just going to line up with those lines, and I'm going to go ahead and trim this block out so that when I pull it up, this is what the block looks like. But I can't do anything to this block yet because the paper is still there. So I think this is kind of a fun activity to do while you're watching TV. What you will do is, I like to fold my paper and give it a little finger press where it is stitched. And if I do that, I put my finger here right at the stitch line, and then I can just peel that paper right off. And you can just keep doing that all the way around until that paper is gone. You want to kind of put some pressure where your stitch line is so that you don't stretch those stitches. So for my block party, because we are going to be doing some embroidery stitches and some wool applique on this, they will go ahead and put a woven stabilizer on the back of it, like Shape Flex or something, and then they'll start doing their stitching. In other paper piece blocks, you don't need to do that, but if you are going to do something on top of that paper piece block, you may want to stabilize it before you stitch that to something else. There are some patterns out there that you put an entire quilt together with all the paper still in it, and then you have this huge quilt that now your next step is to just sit and peel all this paper out. But if you reduce your stitch length, it makes pulling out the paper really, really easy. Okay, I hope that this was just a really quick kind of get you started if you've never paper pieced before or you just needed a little bit of a refresher. It's really fun and you can get some really crisp points if you use this method. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to share our videos. Thanks so much.